Hi, everybody. Welcome to the conversations on decoloniality and fashion. This is an ongoing series that experiments with really sort of alternative forms of knowledge creation and exchange. And we really welcome you into our conversation today. So just to reiterate, the first 30 minutes will be recorded, and then after that, we really encourage you to join in our conversation. And whilst this really is an experimental platform that's really open-ended, and we're really allowed to meet in our differences and explore some, of our unlearnings, we're also reminded that we want to be respectful and mindful of each other's positionalities and life experiences. And we'd also really like to acknowledge the many individuals whose lives have been touched by migration and forced removals and so-called progress, and by political and environmental and social upheavals that really contribute to what Sandra Neeson calls, and others have described as the sacrifice zones. So we acknowledge our privileged positions in this dialogue, especially, and hope to create space for a range of voices to be included in the dialogue, in the rest of the conversation. And really, like between Francesco and I think we really want to create a space, and we're not claiming to speak for others, but with others and through the work that we do. And so in today's session, we're really trying to think about what is our impact in the work that we do when working with fashion activism in contested spaces. My name is Erica de Groep. I'm a curator and an academic and an author. I'm the co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute in South Africa. I'm based in Cape Town. And in my work, I really explore kind of spaces of power and resilience in South African fashion, particularly both in the past and in the present. And I'm really delighted to introduce to you my co-convener today is Francesco Mattarella.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Erica. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me today. Nice to see you all. I still remember, Erica, when we first met. I think it was 2016, maybe. It was in Cape Town. I was doing my PhD at Loughborough University in the UK, but I did some field work in Cape Town. And my doctoral project was about co-designing services and strategies for sustainability and social innovation, working with textile artisan communities. And I'm originally from Italy, but I was doing my PhD in England, and I've always lived the tension of being an outsider or an insider to the communities I work with. And I've always been aware of the issue of designers being parachuted into marginalized communities. And through my PhD, I was exploring and also advocating for a more embedded and situated approach to designing for services. And having lived across cultures and countries, I've always developed a genuine interest in decolonizing fashion practice. And that's, I think, what has connected us, Erica, isn't it, over the years. But also, as Erica said, I also would like to acknowledge my positionality in the work I do. I am a design researcher, an educator, and an activist. And as one of my, I think actually the best way to describe my job is from mentioning what one of my project participants said. She said that my job is all about planting seeds of hope and change, especially when I work with marginalized communities. And also I define, and also in the project that I'm going to talk about, we also engage in the making of textile autobiographies. And I called my artwork as crafting life journeys. And I think, in fact, I'm a craftsman of my own life, and my life looks like a patchwork of the diverse cultures that I've absorbed, having lived throughout my migration journey, having moved to 6 countries in constant search of better education and employment opportunities. Although I must admit, I wasn't forced to leave my country, and I'm not a refugee, but it was my choice. And so I'm originally from Sicily, but I migrated to the north of Italy to study. And then I moved to the Netherlands, Brazil, Hungary, South Africa, where I met Erica. And then I'm based in the UK. And I'm now based in London, where possibly I feel settled. And I'm doing this work as a senior lecturer in fashion and design for social change at London College of Fashion, which is part of UAL. And I know as well that's important because I'm aware that I could take maybe a more radical approach to activism, but in my case, I work within a higher education institution and I've often have funding from local or central government. So I actually am striving to activate change from within the system. And in my work at Center for Sustainable Fashion, I aim to explore ways in which design activism can be used to create counter narratives towards sustainability in and through fashion. Erica, we've always spoken about working with fashion as a means to create cross-cultural engagement and also community development. But can you talk to me about your experience in Cape Town? I remember when I was there, I've really witnessed the difference between the townships and the city, but also I'm aware of the legacy of colonialism that is very evident in South Africa. So can you tell us a bit about your practice in this context and your work towards decolonizing fashion?
Thank you. Well, yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's just so interesting how you kind of describe your life as a kind of patchwork through these journeys. And I think weaving together the kinds of ways in which our work overlaps, but also speaks to one another in using fashion as a means to do something. So I think Cape Town is a really important example that you're kind of bringing up, because I think it is an example of what is also happening further in South Africa, but I think very evident in South Africa is the degree to which the inequalities continue. And these particular inequalities are very, very evident in the lived experiences, but also very evident in sort of social engagements, forms of social engagements. And I think maybe just stepping a little bit further back, the way in which these histories have continued, and sort of thinking through the kind of colonial history of South Africa. But really, I grew up in the apartheid era. So I experienced apartheid. I experienced growing up with certain privileges and certain access to resources, to education, to opportunities, absolutely knowing that others did not. So that experience of inequality as a child. So I was 26 years old when South Africa eventually became a post-apartheid New South Africa, and so really kind of thinking about how do I then embody and then work with those opportunities and those lived experiences. So it was shortly after 1994 that I really started lecturing, and it was in my role as a lecturer that I started to think about how do I make new patterns. So for me, it was about making new patterns of access, or new patterns of visibility, of valuing, and particularly in my case, valuing Afrocentric ideas or Afrocentric sensibilities, when the curriculum and the museums and the exhibitions and the media were all promoting a very colonial Eurocentric idea. And so really, in my sense, I was using fashion as a form of lecturing and as a kind of way of intervening in the classroom, in publications, in curriculum, and more recently in exhibitions. And so really kind of trying to decolonize from within, and giving space to kind of local, and using my privileges, and maybe sort of thinking through like what were my privileges. So I was the one that was able to have that opportunity as a lecturer to be able to open those doors and create those possibilities of access. And I think the thing that we really speak about is that our work is complicated because we are implicated in this kind of entangled and intertwined global colonial history. We are implicated in those relations. And so particularly when we work with outreach or activist craft and design projects, how do we navigate that I think you talk about you talk about that your projects, that your work is about creating resilience for communities. But I'm aware that these communities already have resilience. There's this question of resilience, but in a way, can we do what is needed beyond, or is it, so on a personal level, so navigating the kind of personal and the political. So I'm just wondering if you want to maybe talk about that a bit.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Erica. Well, also, just maybe very briefly, I'm mindful of the time. Time is just already going very quickly. But I will say a few words, really a few, about the project, just to give some context. So I'm working with London-based asylum seekers and refugees on a project called Decoloniality Fashion and Textiles. And really is situated within the context of the mass displacement of people, but also the issue that we need to really value, honor, and sustain the diverse needs and aspirations of refugee communities. There is also the issue of the textile heritage of minority communities that's often the object of cultural appropriation practices, and also it's often undervalued as non-fashion or the sacrifice zone, like Sandra would say. And also, I'm really an advocate for the need to consider culture as a key pillar for a sustainability agenda. And also, as I mentioned before, there is the tension of designers parachuted in the marginalized communities. And instead, instead of perpetuating the system with this dominant practice in which we want to use our knowledge and expertise to solve other people's problems. Instead, I want to show how much we can learn from refugees in terms of cultural sustainability and community resilience. And as well, that's an interesting and challenging space, as you were saying. Also, I must admit that I've often talked about my work in the field, within the field of design for social innovation. And Ezio Manzini talks about design and the politics of the everyday. But actually, more recently, working with refugees, I also realized that my work, even unexplicitly, is really about international politics. And when we do the collective storytelling sessions and my refugee collaborators bring objects, garments, textiles, and accessories from all over the world, actually the coming together of these cultures through the materiality of these objects really opens up very political and sometimes also challenging conversations. Also, there is another issue at play. One of the books or publications, sorry, it's not a book. One of the publications we referenced was the one from Farani, who talks about hospitality or hostility. And as well, there is the stigma of the label of being a refugee. But actually, and as well, we have these conversations with my refugee collaborators. In the end, whether you are an asylum seeker or a refugee, a migrant or a citizen, in the end, we are all human and we all deserve care, empathy, compassion, and inclusion. And yet also in the UK, especially, there is, and I can imagine in other countries, the hostile environment that the state creates. And really it contributes to unemployment, also de-skilling, because for a long time the refugees, asylum seekers, they can't put their skills in action until they get the right to work in the country. And also, even when they get to work in the fashion industry, they are often exploited. So actually, and then there are also lots of other systemic issues, even the living conditions in which asylum seekers live in hotels in London, and that really affects their mental health. But bringing it back to, and then as well, there is this notion of volunteers in charities. They do amazing work, but as well, we perpetrate the notion of helping others. Whereas I think instead, as design activists, we could create conditions for empowerment. And yeah, you touched upon the concept of resilience. I think it's very important that in a way we engage with vulnerable communities, but and in design for social innovation, others often talk about the exit strategy, but I think that this carries with itself a lot of sense of guilt. And rather, I'm always very concerned about building a long-lasting legacy with a community, even beyond the time frame and funding of a project. but we need to be very careful in handling the expectations and from the participants and supporting them beyond the project, and potentially pointing out to other opportunities available in terms of education, employment, or entrepreneurship. So I actually wish that rather than the participants becoming reliant on us as designers, I want to build community resilience. And on this, I want to read a quote from one of my participants who said, "People from the global south are really resilient, and although they shouldn't always have to be resilient, because they also deserve tenderness and loving care instead of violence and resilience. Sometimes resilience is worshipped because it's easier to worship resilient people rather than deconstructing and dismantling the system that oppresses them. Many of them do not even want to be resilient or face this violence, but they have no choice." And I think this really brings a critical perspective to the notion of resilience. Of course, it's a good quality to have, and actually, my refugee collaborators are really showing me that even if they have very limited resources and very challenging lives, they all volunteer, they all share whatever they have and support each other. So this is a strong lesson of resilience for everyone. But of course, it would be better if the system was working well and there was no need for anyone to be resilient. But actually, Erika, here I want to bring a reflection that we have also with Helen's story, who actually I can see is here on the call. Thanks, Helen, for coming. Helen is UNHCR designer in residence, and she's worked in Jordan, but also now in 4 African countries. And she said, the conditions for equality are almost impossible between yourself and those who are interacting with, except in the act of making. Equality, which holds hope, seems to exist in the unplanned and the surprises of our relationships. Almost every refugee I work with shows me something about the life skills that we'll need to deal with the precarity of all our lives going forward. And one of the requirements of a practitioner, artist, or designer working with these sorts of spaces is our ability to be vulnerable and our willingness to be undone. So Erika, can you also speak to this, the need to unlearn, to be undone, or also how the practice of making can help people finding their pathways to reintegration?
I'm just taking a moment to kind of take in what you shared. I mean, I think there was just quite a lot in there, and I think maybe just to kind of point to maybe where our projects might differ is that I don't work with refugees and displaced people. So really kind of sort of thinking about, I mean, you're asking about reintegration and some of the projects that you're working with is how these kinds of fashion projects can allow for a form of integration. And I think so much of my work has not been about reintegration, because that's sort of suggesting like one set of social cultural values proposed over another. So I think my work has really been about kind of decolonizing spaces that begin to welcome diverse, and particularly in South Africa, to push back against that sort of silencing of African aesthetics or practices or principles in social spaces, in cultural spaces, in kind of lived sort of norms. So I think really important to sort of think about that, and so maybe just to bring in a project that I have been working with, and so this is not particularly with refugees, but I'm working with men and women who have become homeless, and again working with a craft-centered project. So we're looking at upcycling, using an upcycling project as a kind of mending project, and sort of the metaphor of mending and life mending and healing. But I think what this project also starts to do is it starts to, and I think what Helen is also pointing to, it's that common space, that place of meeting in the material space, in the realm of fashion, which is all about self and identity and culture and all of that very personal stuff, and it's creating the time around that material object. It's creating the time around material object, which allows for room for understanding each other's positionalities differently. And maybe, and I'm gonna bring in we've sort of also included Sarah Ahmed's reading around strangeness or strange encounters. And in a way, sometimes in those encounters with others that are experiencing such diverse life worlds, what does it allow us to do to rethink our assumptions, to rethink what does it do to us to rethink fashion as a system? Like, what is meant to be a shirt? What is the definition of a shirt? Where did the definition of a shirt come from? How does that create place or personhood or gender or class? All those are embedded questions that and can this work start to help us unlearn? So some of these encounters are also about creating the kind of opportunities for us to allow other kinds of knowledges to filter in. And then what is our role as those conduits? So are we able to do that translation work? Are we able to then bring it back into the norm, bring it back into the publication, bring it back into the realm and say, hold on, is there another way that we can look at this? Is there another way that we can think about it? Yeah. Go.
I will also want to say, well, of course, it's about challenging our positionality, power dynamics, but also being reciprocal in this process so that we are not extractive, but also it is, at least for my, the context is different in which we work. In my case, asylum seekers, refugees are really engaging in collaborative fashion and textile making practices to really express their shifting identities as they're rebuilding their life in a new place. And I think also it's interesting to explore that to a certain extent, this project was also about sustaining cultures, but I also realized that for some of my refugee collaborators, they have very traumatic memories of their home country and they want to erase their own culture. So as well as a designer, to what extent do you allow that to happen? And actually maybe the impacts of colonialism are everywhere. And so we shouldn't consider culture as a return to our roots, but rather as roots through which we navigate, and culture evolves and also we evolve and our identity shifts. But it's interesting that for some people, thinking about the material culture or cultural heritage can be a way to feel rooted whilst they are displaced, whereas others actually want to better assimilate to the new place in which they are rebuilding their lives. And also another thing that, of course, mindful of the time, I just throw it there so that we can unpack maybe in the open discussion. Of course, there is an issue of ethics of care and the duty of care we have towards our vulnerable collaborators, and as well the trajectory of trauma that refugees or asylum seekers go through. In fact, for instance, whilst asylum seekers are still experiencing lots of trauma, whereas refugees may be more settled and they can be a bit more creative and engaged in such projects. But of course, that brings the issue that we need to also collaborate with other professionals who are trauma-informed and can really deal with these dark sides of designing for social change. And also bringing together people from different cultures. I think it's also a very political role, and we need to hold the tension and facilitate dialogue rather than exclusion, rather to host conversations that create inclusion, or what both Hamed and Farhani would say, creating really hospitality, compassion, and actually make us to include diversity and make us become human. In my way, I realized that the only constant in life is really to change, and one of my ambition in my projects is to enable change in others. But I also must admit that I feel transformed myself by engaging in these projects. And my refugee party, I learned so much from my refugee collaborators. They remind us that we don't have to be pushed by our own problems, but rather be driven by our dreams. And finally, I don't know how much time do we have. Shall I read the other quote, or shall we continue the conversation?
Do you want to read? Do you want to read?
And then maybe we can. Well, also these projects are also about, maybe another thing that we can unpack in the open discussion is also the sense of power or empowerment. And I think I've witnessing a journey of from feeling powerless in their own country, or also when they get here and their life on hold whilst they're waiting for the refugee status to be granted, to then starting to build power within themselves, so a sense of self-confidence or self-growth, and then power to fulfill their dreams and aspirations, and also power with others as collective power, so within the communities that they start to belong with. And really, these projects can be very transformative. Of course, I can't claim all these impacts, and as well the issue of impacts, another thing that we can unpack in the discussion. But definitely, I've witnessed the transformation that some of my refugee collaborators go through this process. And that, like, I know that we are talking, as you say, we invited some of our collaborators to be here today. But I will read a quote from one of my participants who, in relation to her textile autobiography that she called Smiles and Pain. And she said, because as well, our work, I think, Erika, and especially you as a curator, is also about shifting narratives and shifting the dominant narratives around those sacrifice zones. So she said, through my artwork, I'd like to invite the viewer to question and unpack what it means to judge asylum seekers and refugees. Many of us are born into dangerous places, living a fruitful and fulfilling life can be impossible due to the amount of violence, instability, and danger that we go through. Although many of us might be wearing a smile and are resilient, behind these smiles and resilience lies inexplicable amounts of trauma, pain, and thoughts of death. We deserve to be treated with tenderness and gentleness, just like everyone else. And it is often forgotten by people who do not have to go through life-altering violence. And amidst rising inequality and insidious asylum policies, I hope to share an insight of what it means to be truly vulnerable and human, and to see the helpless child longing for love and safety in everyone alike. And actually, we'll take a pause here.
I think, thank you so much, and thank you just for sharing also some of the words of others. And I think maybe just in closing, I think what was so interesting in listening through some of this conversation is two words that sort of stand out for me that sound the same, but actually are quite different. And the one is root, and the other is root. And one is the root, which is the origin or the source of the roots in the ground, the kind of connection to place, and the other is root as in a journey. And it's this, I think there's that I think this this work taps into. I think for all of us as a kind of planetary thinking, like what are these roots that we carve out, these journeys that we kind of we need to be thinking about collectively, and then these connections to place as a much bigger kind of question. So absolutely. We could, absolutely, I think we could continue for another hour, but I think we're going to close off here with our recording. And thank you very much. Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you. And let's open up the conversation and let's see how others want to respond to this provocation.